Hello,
How's it
hello.
going?
Hello,
Well,
hello.
we are here to talk about configuring application security features as part of this Learn Live event at Build. I don't know if you're like me, but I can't believe we're at Build again. It's like, wait, I guess it's May. It just seems like the years just travel way too fast. I don't know if you feel that way.
No, it's still May 2020.
That's what it feels like. Ah,
It's your first time at Build, right?
it is my first time at Build, so I have spoken
Welcome.
at Ignite before.
Mm-hmm.
Never Build. I've always been somebody who well, I guess not participates. I am the one that's tuning in, checking out all the cool new features. And so, it's kind of fun being on the other side of it.
Exactly. And apparently I'm good enough that they invited me back for round 2.
You
Which is
didn't say
great.
the wrong things last year, right?
I didn't do the wrong things. I managed to keep my job, and I'm back here to talk about identity and security with the awesome Shannon, who we work together anyway every day.
We do. Yeah.
It's business as usual, just different platform.
Basically, it's almost like
Yeah.
we're doing a 425 show stream. And so we'll
Yeah.
do a quick plug, check out our show.
Exactly.
We do a lot of fun stuff. So if you don't know who I am, I'm Shannon Kuehn. It looks like it's not Keen, but it is Keen. And there's a whole story behind that. I'll go into it later at some point if you're curious. You can connect with me on Twitter. My Twitter handle's there. I'm a senior program manager on the Identity and Network Access Advocacy team.
Very nice. And I am Christos. I work in the same team as Shannon. I'm a senior program manager, and both me and Shannon are passionate about identity and security. That's why they chose us to come and talk to you about application security for Azure. Okay, so today's module, it's one of these sub-modules. So we have the SC400, and we chose this one because it can fit in an hour and you can follow along if you want. Make sure to scan the barcode, or take your time and go and click that URL to do it at your own spare time. We're going to go through the module today, add some commentary, add some insights about why and how, but we will urge you to do, and in fact, complete the whole SC400 and go and see the certification because it's
actually
great.
It's actually the AZ500.
In my defense, it's been a very long day because I am at the other side of the world, still jet lagged, and I did 2 sessions today at a different event. So for me, it's like 8 p.m. and I've been up since 6. So
you're a trooper. You're a trooper. You're a trooper.
I'm a trooper. I'm here. Right. Next slide. So what are the objectives here? Obviously, we want to educate you around how to use application registrations in Azure and what they mean. And we'll also show you how to select and configure Azure AD users that can access applications. And then finally, we'll talk about web app certificates because they're very important for securing your applications.
I think the big piece here is this is a live and interactive session. So join the chat, say hi, ask questions. We have some of our esteemed colleagues who are moderating the chat at the moment. So we'll give a wave to those folks.
Yes, thanks you.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks for helping.
Of course, thanks for joining and thanks for helping. Ask the questions. If they can't answer, and they should be able to answer, but if they can't answer, we'll in theory have some time to answer towards the tail end of this session.
Absolutely. So, our first line of defense is awesome. We have some awesome people behind the scenes.
We do. So thanks to those folks and thanks for tuning in. So I think without further ado, let's dig in. So we'll talk a little bit about the introduction here.
Yes.
So application security is one extra layer of the defense in depth strategy. So if you think about the different layers, it's another layer of defense. So in order to configure application security, you have to first ensure your application is registered within an Azure Active Directory tenant. This gives it a unique identity inside of Azure AD. From there, you can manage and control both access to the application and then what the application can do.
Yep, very important.
Now, just like all Learn modules, there is a scenario, right? So a security engineer uses application security to protect the usage of your application and prevent the loss of data. Throughout this module, you will work on such tasks as registering applications with Azure Active Directory, assigning permissions for the application and the users to access that application, and then we'll talk about the usage of certificates and secrets to protect operations and data.
Yeah, one thing I want to highlight here is that sometimes there's no security engineer. It could be a developer if it's a small company.
It could be. But this specific Learn module says security. So yes, exactly. And I think this is a topic that I think developers sort of get a little stuck on. So hopefully it makes some more sense as you walk through this module with us. So as we mentioned, this is part of the AZ500 path here. So it's the Microsoft Azure Security Engineer Associate exam. So, and there's, I think, 4 or 5 different major learn paths. This is like a module within one of the learn paths. So it's definitely a hot topic, and it's something that we wanted to spend some time going over this today with you. And then you can always, you can always take a scan of the QR code, or you could click on that, or I guess put that aka.ms link in a browser, and it'll take you to the same Learn module if you want to follow along live.
That's right. And it's not the SC400 that I was saying earlier on.
There is an SD400. That's why it gets a little confusing.
There is. Because we've been talking about that for the last 3-4 weeks, but it's the AZ500, which is great for getting you up to speed with security features on Azure.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Let's review the Microsoft Identity Platform. This is the rebrand, right? We used to have Azure AD, and then became the Microsoft Identity Platform a couple of years ago. And this encompasses the identity provider that Microsoft provides. That's a service, right? As with every other identity service, maybe you've used Facebook before to authenticate users, or maybe you use Google or Twitter or any other provider that has social logins. You have to register an application. Azure Active Directory is no different. You have to go into Azure and say, I'm going to use Azure Active Directory to sign in my users, and maybe grab tokens to send to APIs or what have you.
Right.
That's the first step. That's how you start. And to interact in your application with Azure Active Directory, you have to use a library. Now, we do have our own libraries, the Microsoft Authentication Libraries, MSAL for short. And this is the latest version of our libraries, and they're available in multiple languages. However, since the Microsoft Identity Platform is built on top of open standards, you can use any open source library that is compliant with OpenID Connect and OAuth 2. In some instances, you may have to go back to Azure Active Directory to request some API permissions and configure some web APIs. That's important because sometimes, applications don't just need to sign in users. They also need to acquire tokens to go and call other services. They all need to be declared in the Microsoft Identity Platform. When it comes to identities, this is a hot topic, as Shannon likes to say, because it can be confusing. Which flavor of the Microsoft Identity Platform are we going to use and we need to use? There are 2 main flavors. There is the Azure AD, the Azure Active Directory, which is used for work and school accounts. This is when you need to create a line of business application for your internal users to sign in. And sometimes in that scenario, you might also allow some personal accounts, the MSA, the Microsoft accounts that can be used to sign in to those tenants as well. However, if you're building an application that is for consumers, maybe you're building your next store and you want people to sign up and buy things. Maybe you're building a forum and you want people to sign in and create accounts. Or maybe you're building the next Walmart, the next startup.
Dream big. What you do in your spare time, right?
Dream big, exactly. You never know. One day you could be the next Walmart. So you need something to control your users, and we don't want you to roll your own identity. In that instance, you have to use Azure Active Directory B2C, business to consumer, business to customer, whatever you want to call it. And this allows you to have a username and password database at its base level, or you can add social media logins, like your customers can come in and say, I want to sign in with my Twitter. I don't want to create a brand new account. And that allows you to do it. Just to reiterate, Azure Active Directory is for internal users, and Azure Active Directory B2C is for external users, people that are not part of your organization. In between, there are a lot more things like B2B and other complex scenarios that we don't want to cover here because we don't want to overcomplicate things. But that's the gist of it. And because, as I said, we are built on top of standards, like FIDO, which is very big these days. It's all about passwordless. We don't want people to use passwords anymore. Right. FIDO is the great way to do that. OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect, and SAML. SAML is still around after 900 years, as our esteemed colleague likes to say. So that is a very quick review. You create an app registration, you add some library code in your solution to authenticate against Azure Active Directory, and then maybe grab some tokens. And then you choose the right flavor before you get started, and you're sorted. A few lines of code. There you go. Back to you, Shannon.
All right. So let's talk about the Azure AD application scenarios. So an application that outsources authentication into Azure AD just needs to be registered within the directory, right? That step involves Azure Active Directory sort of knowing about your application. Prior to it, Azure Active Directory doesn't know what you're trying to do. So you do need to register that within your Azure AD tenant. So if you think about it, Azure AD then represents applications kind of following a specific model that's designed to fulfill two main functions. So first, you'll be able to identify that app. You'll be able to then understand the authentication that it supports. You'll be able to enumerate through the identifiers, the URLs, the secrets, et cetera, all that metadata. From there, you can handle the user consent, right, during the token request time. So that helps you facilitate the dynamic provisioning of apps. That'll help you just related to, should your users actually consent on behalf of going into that app by way of their authentication. So if you think about it, the diagram that's shown here on the screen, it sort of offers up a pretty, I guess, high level overview, right?
Yeah, rudimental. It's basic. It's not all the
Right.
details.
Right. There are a lot more complex flows that you can think about, but
Yeah.
because we're just trying to get folks excited about this, we thought let's start with the high level kind of overview. So think about it like this. User A from a user from tenant B tries to sign into the app. So Azure AD will get and verify the credentials. Azure AD prompts the user to consent for the app to gain access to tenant B. So Azure AD then uses the application object in A as a blueprint for creating a service principal in B. Then the user receives the requested token. So you can repeat this process as many times as you want for other tenants, right? This is just as kind of a singular app. But then directory A keeps that blueprint for the app. And users and admins of all of their tenants, where the app is given consent you can think about, it'll kind of correspond to the service principal that you've kind of created inside of the original tenant. So that's kind of the overview of the whole scenario that we're trying to sort of, I guess, help you out with understanding today.
I've got two things. One is that the service principal will always be a carbon copy, as Shannon said. So if you have a multi-tenanted application in your tenant, you only get the carbon copy of the original application. But somebody needs to create that application, and we'll show you how to do that in a bit. Shannon will go through the process, and you'll understand what it is and how it works.
It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say pretty straightforward, but once you get your head around it, it becomes straightforward. And the second one is the consent. So for most of you that you use mobile phones, I'm pretty sure, but most of us have mobile phones. Every time you download an application, it says, hey, this application wants to use your contacts, or it needs to have access to your photos. The Azure Active Directory has the exact same kind of framework for users to consent. So developers need to request the permissions that their application needs, and the users need to consent to that. So if you access an Azure Active Directory application that it's supposed to be sending emails and suddenly requests access to all their pictures and all your calendar information, you are presented with the option to decline. And that is very valid because you don't want to give everyone access to your data. And that's what the consent framework does, which is fantastic. It keeps you in control of your data.
Yeah.
Cool.
So let's kind of walk through the process a bit here, and we'll go through this with a demo later in the actual module. So for the most secure operation here, you'll register your app within the Microsoft Identity Platform. So before your app can even get a token from the Microsoft Identity Platform, it must be registered in the Azure portal. Now you can also do this with AZ CLI, with PowerShell, etc. Whatever makes the most sense. I often feel like, I don't know if you feel this way, Christos, when I'm starting something brand new, I'll probably go in the portal first. Just to make sure I understand it. And once I do that and I realize all of the steps involved, I'll try and automate that, because I don't know, I think I'm always this lazy administrator, right? Like, how can I do this faster with less effort, right? So the registration itself, it integrates your app with the Microsoft Identity Platform, and it establishes the information that it uses to get tokens. So if you think about it, you've got an application ID, which is a unique identifier assigned by the Microsoft Identity Platform. I'll show you what that looks like. You can also think of that as like a client ID as well. Then you've got the opportunity to put in a redirect URI or a URL. So this is one or more endpoints at which your app will receive responses from the Microsoft Identity Platform. Now, for native and mobile apps, this is a URI assigned by the Microsoft Identity Platform. Then you also get a secret, and don't worry, I'm going to use Azure Mask. You don't get to see my secret, although I am going to probably remove it as soon as this, this live event is over.
Yep.
But it's a password or it's a public or private key pair that your app uses to authenticate to the Microsoft Identity Platform. And that's not needed for native or mobile apps.
No. Yeah, and you need to be very careful with your application secrets. If you are putting them into your code, you need to be very, very careful about.
Please don't.
Please don't.
Right? Please don't. Please don't.
Please don't. And technically, depending on the scenario, you will know what and when you need an application secret, as Shannon said.
So now we're over to Christos.
Yes, we are indeed. Microsoft Graph is our unified API that allows you to access organizational data without having to go through the pain of authenticating to all these services independently. If you've ever had to work with SkyDrive, who was around when OneDrive used to be SkyDrive? I don't know if you remember that.
Is this where we're like begrudgingly raising our hands?
Yeah, well,
it just means we're old, right?
Trying to authenticate to that, it had its own identity system and it had its own libraries, which was awful because you would authenticate to that and then trying to access other data like CRM meant you had to re-authenticate. What we did is we took all those APIs, all those services inside Microsoft, and we gave them a common surface. So you authenticate once and you ask permissions to access different components, but you don't have to re-authenticate. You just need to reconsent and say, yeah, I want to add more permissions to my account. Next slide, please. There are two types of permissions. This is very important. So we have delegated and application permissions. Now, the first one, delegated, is when a user requests permission for themselves. So instead of name them user permissions, I don't know why we did that, we name them delegated to make identity even harder for everyone to understand. We like obscurity. Anyway, that means that when I need to access something as myself, or the application needs to access something as myself or on my behalf, we need to configure delegated permissions inside our app registration. When the application acts on its own, let's assume it's a headless app, right? It's a daemon app that needs to do something, or maybe it doesn't care who I am. It needs to act as its own and maybe go and get everybody's calendar information or everybody's email to serve something, then that's an application permission. Depending on the permissions and depending on the type of the application that is accessing these permissions, there are different implications that you need to consider. But for now, we're not going to cover that. The important bit here is that you need to understand that delegated permissions are for users to be able to get their data, whereas application permissions is for the application to go and grab anything that it needs in the directory. And usually they're more elevated. So what you'll find is even me and Shannon can go and add delegated permissions to our Microsoft tenant. It won't stop us from doing that because it's all our data, so I can access my data. However, if I go and create an application permission to access everyone's data at Microsoft, MSIT will say, no, Christos, you can't do that. We can't give you access to 170,000 employees' data. And that's where we know how we can segregate and secure access to data, right? We don't want everyone to have access, unsolicited access to data. And we have to ask for permission for that if we really need, and there's a use case. So next slide, please. And then, with the Microsoft API, there is a Microsoft Security API gateway that is used to actually secure access to the backend services. So Azure Active Directory is used to authenticate, and then the requests are propagated down to the Microsoft Security API to ensure that we have the right permissions. This is where MSIT has put all the blocking and detection and says, no, you can't do that. But it also protects us from threats. If someone tries to access the data without having the right permissions, then it will be stopped. There are advanced capabilities within the platform to throttle, to make sure that you don't bring the system down if you make too many requests, to batch things to make it more efficient, and obviously to monitor the security operations around the service to ensure that my data and your data stay safe. That was me. And yeah, I mean, this is the flow, which I don't want to go through that because technically you're not going to be seeing that either. but it explains how the whole consent works. Remember how we said about consent, right? The application needs to request me to consent to the data that needs to be sent out. Then that consent gets stored on the provider side, which is the Azure Active Directory. And then the provider sends the call to the security API to say, hey, consent has been given by the customer. Now, please send us the request and the data back. And then
Bless
in
you.
the result, thank you very much. I've been
Proof for
talking too
live,
much.
right? Proof
of live.
for
Yeah,
live.
it's live. It's live. We haven't cut it. And then eventually the data will be sent back to the application and the user. However, if the customer has not consented, then the individual providers, let's say CRM, I requested some CRM data, there will be no results back. And in fact, you need to configure your application to gracefully respond to no consent from the user. It should be something like, until you consent to these data, you cannot access them. Make sure that your application doesn't crash because suddenly you get no data back from your API calls to Graph. Very important. Yeah, that's it.
So then,
go on. Sorry.
Why should you use the Microsoft Graph API? So, if you think about it, there's a unified interface and schema to integrate with security solutions from Microsoft and ecosystem partners. So this really does empower everyone to streamline security operations and better defend against the increasing cyber threats, right? So the Microsoft Graph Security API federates queries to all onboarded security providers and aggregates responses. So as a developer, you can connect once to integrate alerts from any Microsoft Graph integrated security solution and keep alert status and assignments in sync across solutions, which is pretty cool.
Nice.
If you think about it too, there's a lot of great community tooling out there, right? So you can find code examples in C#, Java, Node.js, etc. You can connect to Microsoft Graph using scripts. There's a bunch of PowerShell examples that are out there.
Or the Azure CLI.
Correct. We probably should have added that. Whoops. Yeah. It's okay. We can talk about that, right? So this is coming from the Learn module, and the Learn module must talk about PowerShell. We probably should have put the AZ CLI in there as well. You can drag and drop this into workflows and playbooks. So you can use the Microsoft Graph Security Connectors for Azure Logic Apps, Microsoft Flow, and Power Apps. This is helpful because more and more folks are using those. You don't have to really think about setting this up from scratch. It's sort of already there, ready to go, and you just need to plug it into the API, right? So then there's a great way to get data and reports into dashboards. I don't know about you, Christos, but I always love a good dashboard and I always love a good report.
Who doesn't love dashboards?
Right? I mean, because there's usually pretty colors and you understand exactly how things are functioning within your environment, right? I mean, maybe it's a pie chart, maybe it's a bar chart. So you can think about using the Microsoft Graph Security Connector for Power BI. So if you're a Power BI aficionado, and there are quite a bunch of folks out there, I keep saying I need to go deep on that as well. So maybe there's an opportunity for us to do something on that in the future. And then you can think about connecting, using Jupyter notebooks as well. So there are a bunch of Jupyter notebook samples out.
And you know what? We do have samples that we automated all the Azure Active Directory application registration provisioning for end-to-end scenarios using notebooks, Python notebooks, or .NET notebooks, even JavaScript notebooks. So if you want to avoid the manual steps that we will see later on that Shannon will go through the process, you can automate all that. Yeah. And you can write code because we have fantastic SDKs that support the Microsoft Graph APIs.
Now, is that in the 425 show repo, Christos?
It is. It is in the 425 show repo. We can share the link later on if anyone wants to go and grab them.
So let's talk a little bit about managed identities, right?
Oh, yes. My favorite topic.
This is the realm that I'm still kind of exploring myself, right?
Yep.
So a common challenge when building cloud applications is how do you manage credentials in your code, especially if you're authenticating to cloud services. So keeping credentials secure is a really important task. It's not for the faint of heart, especially because people do cycle their passwords or you do have password theft. Yep. So ideally, the credentials never appear on a developer's workstation, right? So ideally, you've got a situation where you're not having to manage the password or the username, right?
Yeah.
So managed identities provide a way for you to have the authentication taken care of by Azure. Yes. Sounds pretty cool, right? And I feel like that's where everybody wants to get. So, applications may use the identity to obtain Azure AD tokens. And this is really important if you're thinking about managing things like storage, Cosmos DB, even Azure VMs, right? So
Exactly.
managed identities, they provide Azure services with an automatically managed Azure AD identity. So that identity authenticates to any service that supports Azure AD authentication without any credentials in your code.
Yeah,
So
that's very important, because in the early days we didn't have really good support for mass identities. Like VMs and app service had them, and they could call a subset of services. It has been a major priority for our division and for Azure to enable that end to end. So you'll see more and more and more services. In fact, today it will be unlikely to find a service that doesn't support mass identities out of the box. And
I
this
agree.
is amazing, because it's an Azure Active Directory backed object that enables end-to-end communication without you having to manage the keys, because service principals, which is something that we control all the time, like me and Shannon know the pain, have secrets and keys that expire, and then
Yes.
things go kaboom and they don't work anymore. Right.
So you can think of this as a special service principal.
It's a special
right?
service principal. Yes.
It's the service principal with all of the magic powers, because you don't have to be on the hook for the password, right? So you get a client ID, which is a unique identifier generated by Azure AD that is tied to an application and service principal during the provisioning process.
Yep.
Then you get a principal ID. It's the object ID of the service principal object for your managed identity that is used to grant role-based access to an Azure resource. The big thing here to call out is the bit at the bottom here, the Azure Instance Metadata Service. So this is a REST endpoint accessible to all IaaS VMs created via the Azure Resource Manager, I guess kind of fabric layer, right?
Yeah.
The endpoint is available to a well-known non-routable IP address that can only be accessed from in the VM.
So I have a question for you.
Sure.
Do you think that the batch service has access to that, or is it only the VMs?
Is this a trick question, Christos?
Well, we need to test it, because
the VM would
they
have
are compute, right?
Yeah. So, but again, that's kind of that weird fuzzy area where I haven't looked at Azure Batch for a bit. I would think
we haven't.
Yes, but with can I go check the documentation after this?
We can, absolutely. Or you can reach out to us if you have any questions about mass identities. Now, the important bit here is that this IMDS, that endpoint, is only available on VMs. And usually you may not need to call it unless you want to explicitly do something within your application, because technically in a VM, you don't interact directly with the mass identity. You have to actually, your application has to call it. However, depending on what you're running, if you're using the Azure SDKs, for example, you automatically get the mass identity to use. But if you want to explicitly get the token for something, then that's when you need that endpoint, just to clarify. Because I think it will come up later, right? Just so pay attention.
It will.
Remember this. We discussed it.
So there are two different types. It's so funny is the actual text was almost the same. I'm like, did I actually click it? I did. I had a panic moment of, oh God, did
we can always go back, Shannon. We can always go back and forth. We control the slides.
But it happened so fast that I was like, oh my gosh, did it do? Okay, we're good. So there are two different types of identities in the realm of managed identities, right? So there's a system assigned identity, and then there's a user assigned managed identity. And I think prior to preparing for build, I myself had only been playing around with system assigned managed identities, right? So managed identity for storage, right? And I'm accessing that from within a VM. If I delete that VM, I also delete that managed identity, right? That's kind of the big piece here. That's the realm of system assigned. A user assigned managed identity gives you more granularity in terms of control within your application. So let's say your application has a bunch of different components, right? So it's got app service, it's got storage, it's got Cosmos DB. We'll just say those three, right? That's a pretty straightforward app if you think about it. That user assigned managed identity can be, so let's just say that VM goes away, right? The managed identity doesn't go away. You can place that identity back into another app. So this is really important if you are somebody who's constantly redeploying applications and you don't want to have to worry about storing your credentials in code. And well, you wouldn't really store it in code. You'd store it in Key Vault and pull it from Key Vault. But if you want to think about taking it one layer deeper and having that defense in depth strategy, definitely explore managed identities. And I think one of my big takeaways when I was prepping this with Christos is I need to go and play around with the user assigned managed identities a little bit more. Don't I, Christos?
That's right. Everybody needs to play around with managed identities because they're fantastic. Now, there is a limitation that managed identities are only available on Azure. And some people might say, well, we would love this goodness to be available on other environments. If you are running on Azure Arc devices, like if you have AWS workloads or if you have on-premises workloads that you want to onboard to Azure via Azure Arc, then guess what? You automatically get a managed identity for these workloads. So if your desktop is Azure Arc joined onto Azure, even though it's sitting under your desk, it behaves and looks like an Azure VM, and it can get a managed identity out of the box, which is great. And for those scenarios that you cannot use a managed identity, the Azure SDKs team has done a fantastic job in allowing you to interject or play around with the different credentials. So when you're developing locally on your machine or when you're creating scripts, you can use a service principal or your own account. But when you move to Azure, without having to change the code, it will automatically pick up the managed identity. And there are strategies for that. You can reach out to us if you want more details. There's one more thing I wanted to talk about with regards to managed identities that is a very not well-known fact. You can use managed identities to access Azure services, obviously, because that's what they were built for. But you can also use managed identities to call your own APIs. You can configure.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, see,
really cool.
I kept it for a surprise, and Shannon is genuinely surprised for this one.
I am. I didn't know that, and that's kind of a cool little extra.
It is
little bit of nugget, little bit of a what? It's a knowledge nugget, right?
So you can get your web app to go to Azure AD and request an access token for your API, and then use that managed identity to call your API without having to set up anything else, which is great.
That's pretty cool. I think that hopefully get you excited.
Mic drop. I'm out.
Mic drop. Christos is done. He's gonna drop out for the rest of the set. I'm kidding. He's not.
No, I'm staying.
You're on the hook.
Don't panic.
You're on the hook. You're on the hook, my friend.
Right. Take it away, Simon.
All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about deploying web app certificates.
Yes.
So you can restrict access to your Azure App Service by enabling different types of authentication, right? So one way to do it is to request a client certificate when the client request happens over TLS or SSL and validate that certificate, right? So this mechanism is called TLS mutual authentication or client certificate authentication. So if you access your site over HTTP and not HTTPS, you won't receive that client certificate. So if your application requires client certificates, and we always say that it should. You should not allow requests for your application over HTTP, which is probably a good way to think about strengthening your security posture. To set it up, it's pretty straightforward. You go in and you literally just switch it to on, related to require incoming certificate. So it's inside of the configuration blade, and it's in part of the general settings inside the portal. So you can always do this via code, right? I think that's the big thing to always make mention of. You can always do whatever you see in the portal via code, but if you're not familiar with it, start with the portal, get some familiarity, and then go explore what that looks like in terms of building it out with code.
That is right. You can use ARM, you can use Bicep, you can use Terraform, or any tool that you use to deploy to also configure that on the fly during deployment. So you don't have to do it in the portal if you are not a portal person.
Right. And the portal does change too. So if you do it in the portal one day and maybe you don't touch it again for a couple of months and you go back in, the UI might have changed. So that's another thing just to be conscious of as you're learning more in the realm of Azure.
Because we like to move your cheese around to keep you on your toes.
Oh, right.
Yes.
Keep us on our toes too. I mean, we have the same problem, so it's not like you're alone. So I guess you could just find us on Twitter and commiserate if it's frustrating to you. And we'll just tell you that you're not alone. And
it's not a
there's
problem.
The numbers, right?
It's an opportunity to learn more.
Exactly. That's actually probably a better way of wording it. That's a better way of wording it. It's not, you're right. It's not a problem. It's an opportunity to learn more. And we can definitely be kind of your coaches throughout that process.
Yes. That's absolutely right. Now, on the next slide, there is an option for you to exclude paths from requiring authentication. Now, this is a little bit weird because we all know that search engines and security requires us to always have TLS and SSL enabled. However, there might be valid scenarios, which I find far and few, that you may want to exclude certain paths within your application from requesting and requiring TLS and SSL. If you need to do that, you can go into the configuration and general settings and define an exclusion path. And then for those paths that you exclude, then there will not be a requirement for having a certificate. Again, I don't find many scenarios in our customer engagements that would need to do that, but the fact that you can exclude them if you need them, it's there for you to play around with, right? And accessing the client certificate, that's also something very important. When you run in-app services, deploying web apps and APIs, the load balancer in front of your app, which is semi-transparent, you don't really see that, will terminate TLS before passing the traffic back to your application. If you really want to request the certificate to be forwarded to your application, then you can configure that, and then the token, the HTTPS certificate, will be injected into a header under x-arr-client certificate, which is very well documented in the app service documentation. That means that you can, in code now, you can access that header, download the token. Maybe you need to encrypt or hash or validate something using that certificate, and then your code can access that certificate without having to install it or make it available through embedding the code, for example.
Sure.
So now you know.
Very cool. So there is an exercise at the end of this module. Christos and I talked about it quite a bit. We think that the module works, so don't feel like you can't go and take a look at the module. There's a little bit easier way to set this up.
Correct.
So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into my tenant. Now, this is a personal tenant. And if you remember, I'm Shannon Kuehn, so my nickname in high school was Shakeen, and I've owned that domain for forever. So
I love it.
So this is probably the domain I've owned for 900 years, right? Back when SAML was created.
Should we say how people can get their own tenants if they want to?
Yes. So this is something that I didn't necessarily realize until I even came to Microsoft. So there's a way for you to get a developer tenant.
Yes.
And I know we say it's a developer tenant. You could just be an Office 365 engineer, right? You could be somebody that needs to know how to do services inside this realm because you're providing services to your end users. You can go and sign up for that dev tenant. And so long as you're doing things in that dev tenant, correct me if I'm wrong, Christos, that dev tenant will stay up and it will stay live, correct?
If you access the tenant once every 90 days, it will continue to renew in perpetuity until you have no need for us anymore. I hope you will always have a need for us.
Yeah, exactly.
Once every 90 days, I get those emails saying, congratulations, you get another 90 days to play around. and it is important to say that it is available to everyone. You don't need a credit card. It's not like the Azure free trial, so no credit card. Just go and put your email, and we'll create a tenant for you, which is awesome. It's a P2 tenant, right? Not just any tenant.
Yes, it is. It's a P2 tenant. Now, this tenant is not necessarily, it's a P2 tenant, but this tenant also houses my email. So
don't break it.
I know. I really can't break it, right? So but I do have a P2 license on this tenant, as you can see here.
Nice.
So let's go down to application registrations.
Yes. We talked about them before, right? But we didn't do the demo now. So Shannon is going to do the demo.
Correct. And I will build out a brand new registration. So this is the AZ500. We'll call it the AZ500 app, right? So, if you're following along, it's something like this in the Learn module. The cool part here, you can see the granularity down here. So you can, just your organization only. Accounts in any organizational directory, right? So multi-tenant apps, and personal accounts, pretty interesting, right? Or just personal accounts. So the MSA, I only want this to be MSA accounts that are coming in. You can set up the redirect URI here. I am not going to. I'll show you another spot you can do it. Just because of the fact I feel like people learn a lot of different ways. So if you are following along, you can always place a URI, a redirect URI in here, and then just select the platform as being web. We're going to use Postman, right? Because everybody loves Postman. And I've used it more. right?
Yeah.
I've used it a ton more now that everything's software defined. So I am going to click
But
on.
if you use other tools to do HTTP requests, you don't have to use Postman, but Postman is super awesome for interacting with Azure Active Directory and learning. Yeah.
Right. So now I have Azure Mask on. I will turn it off briefly here just to show you.
And I will remind you later on to put it on before you,
good
saw the naughty
call.
bits.
Good call. So I need the client ID for Postman. So I've got a notepad opened up on my other window. The other bits here, you don't need to worry about too much for this specific exercise, right? There's other exercises that you can do where you might need your directory ID, you might need your object ID. So let's go into authentication.
Right, mask on, please.
Well, I'm not going to create the secret just yet, but
I want to protect you.
So I'm going to add a platform. We are going to choose web. Now, if you aren't familiar with what to use as the redirect URI, guess
Postman
what?
tells you.
Postman tells you. So this is the bit here that's a little bit different. There's a kind of a, I don't know, I would call this sort of a pre-canned sort of thing here, right? So you've got a lot of different pieces to choose from. We're doing OAuth 2.0, so why don't I just go there? Just keep scrolling down. Here is that callback URL. Oh gosh, that's so great and amazing. Let me copy that.
And this is where Azure Active Directory will return tokens. So it knows that it has to send it back to do Postman, right? That's what it means. That's what the redirect URI is. Yeah.
So I'm going to place that in here. And I'm not going to deal with implicit flows. But I mean, this is where you get to more advanced levels of token-based authentication.
Yeah, and more legacy. Implicit flows are generally avoided. So, but for some scenarios that we need to still support it, it is there for you. That's right.
So if you're following along, just a quick redirect URI. Click on configure. Let's just make sure that it added it. It did. We're good. Okay. So actually, let's do this too. Let's go into the endpoints. Oh, and let me take off because we do need the endpoint.
Mask off. That's my role here. Mask on, mask off.
We need the OAuth 2.0 authorization endpoint. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to put that over here on my scratch paper. And I also need the token endpoint, right? So this is 2.0. So I'm going to place that over here as well. Okay, so we're good. Now mask on. I'm going to go create a secret.
Oh, I forgot to say mask on. You were so far ahead of me.
I was so far ahead of you. I was. So it's pretty straightforward, right? There's no secret for this application. We're going to create a secret. So I'll just call it test secret. Spell it correctly. You can, set a custom defined amount of time, 6 months, 3 months, 12 months. Just know that if you set time here and you have an application that's in production, make sure that you've got a calendar reminder, some sort of Azure function that alerts you, right? Because you don't want to have your application go down, because it will if the password.
You can create a graph task that goes and interrogates your API, your app registrations for expiries. I think me and JP started writing it at some point. However, I would also like to say, just because it has a custom expiration date, please don't go and make it 10 years ahead of time.
Yeah, that's not a good practice.
Your keys need to be rotated all the time. So it's a good practice to make sure that you rotate your keys and have a short period of lifespan.
Yeah. So let's hit add. Now notice how Azure Mask is masking.
It's doing its job.
The secret.
Nobody can hack Shannon today. All your hopes for hacking are gone.
I am secure today. There are days I have not been secure. And so it's good. Azure Mask is great. If you're not familiar, we probably should put a link in there as well. But if you're not familiar, it's a great little extension for any, I think it's Chrome and then Edge, the new Edge, right? So I think those are the two that I know of. I don't know if there's one for Firefox.
Hit Shannon on Twitter if you want to find out.
I'll get to the bottom of it. I know it's developed internally by Microsoft folks. Yeah, right. Bug me on Twitter. I enjoy it. I encourage it. So okay. So we've got everything set up in the Azure portal now, right? So the app is here, everything's set up.
You don't need anything else.
Just make sure that I got the right application ID, because when we were prepping, I got the wrong application ID.
We can come back and fix it.
We can always come back and fix it.
I trust you.
Right?
I trust you. Yeah.
All right. So So we've got all of this in here. I am going to leave this as nothing, right? So the authorization code, I'm going to leave that.
Yep.
We're going to authorize using the browser. Okay, so this is the auth URL. Let me grab it from over here, paste that in. Oh, not on me. You will see my client secret. Well, the beauty is it won't be.
We'll
you won't
delete
see
it
for very long. Yeah, you won't go see it for very long.
Please
So,
don't hack.
There's
Shannon's
no
emails,
mask.
please.
There's no mask for
There's no
Postman.
mask. I know.
This is the token URL.
It's a business opportunity if somebody out there wants to write it.
Maybe we should write it, or we should just get somebody else to write. I'm kidding. We should. Yeah, somebody else should write it, not us.
Technically, if you were doing it right, or if you were doing it right, you can use a variable to actually pass it in. But for now, we'll just brute force it.
Yeah, and the beauty is, I believe if you start clicking around in here, it just opens up the variables so that you can do it there. So I'm going to paste that secret in, and then we're going to move down here. That was a very fast secret. If you got the secrets, you get an extra credit point. We are going to just have this be user read.
So that's a graph. That's a special graph
Special scope for
permission.
Yep.
To read.
And what we're going to do is we're going to send as a basic auth header. So this should, kick it over. And you see that now, granted, and this is my account has access to this tenant. So now you know my Microsoft email. You can write me some emails there too. So this is the app, right? And this is the tenant it's joining into. I'm not going to consent on behalf of the organization. I'm just going to hit accept.
Yes.
The call's authenticated. Now I get the authentication complete message. We can wait a couple of seconds here. And now I've got a token. So I can use this token. Yay.
Success.
Now the token shows up in here, right? It's a bearer token.
What are we going to do with the token? What are we going to call?
We are going to go into the graph endpoint. So
nice.
Now you can find this on Microsoft. What is it? aka.ms
/G, the Graph Explorer. You can find all that there.
G, because he said G and I did G and then it didn't go anywhere. It's GE. And you'll get to the Graph Explorer that helps you out with understanding the different APIs that you can, the different API endpoints you can hit. So now this all works, unfortunately, because I have it blown up so everybody at home can see it. I have to scroll over and hit send. So now let's hit send. Now you got a status of 200. So that's
always positive. The 200 is like, okay, we got something. And then that's the data.
So you got my info. Very cool, right? So you see that, yep, I'm sitting in my Shakeen tenant with my Microsoft ID and I got a response.
Perfect.
Which is pretty cool. Now, I think what's even cooler here is there's a different scope that we want to talk about.
And why do you want to talk about that?
Because you might have an app that needs to read all of the users in your tenant, right? And read, not write, read, right? I was trying to think of an example. I couldn't. I think I blame that a lot on. So my life right now is I've got a little young one at home, so I couldn't think of one. So we're going to change the scope, right? And we're going to keep everything the same. I'm going to get a brand new access token because if I reuse this access token, it won't give me a 200 status.
That is right.
So I'm going to go in again. Same sort of
another consent.
Now I can read all users' full profiles.
On your own tenant, not a Microsoft tenant.
It's not a Microsoft tenant. Yeah, we should stress heavily that in no way, shape, or form is this the Microsoft tenant.
I mean, if you want to showcase, we could, but you'll get a nice error message here saying your admin needs to consent. You cannot consent. There you go.
So I'm gonna hit accept, and it has been accepted. So now I can wait for this to, or I can hit proceed.
Proceed. Yeah.
There's the token. So let's use that token. Now the endpoint you want to hit is users.
Yes, all the users.
That's what changes.
170,000 of them.
Right.
Get the data.
That's a ton of users, right? No, I'm kidding. I only have, I think I have like 1,000 like test users or something in here. So I'll hit send. I got all of them. So like, look at this.
Look at that. It's amazing.
These users. So you can come down. These are all like, because we've got this great way of generating names at Microsoft. So these are just names that I've used our name generator.
Yes.
Plugged them in here, but it's all of the users. So I mean, I can go all the way down here if I wanted to.
Now, I want to say something very important. The fact that we were able to update the permission on the fly is all based down to the dynamic consent that the V2 endpoint in Azure Active Directory supports. If you notice, we didn't go back to the app registration to configure any API permissions. We were able to dynamically request them. So your application can also dynamically request permissions based on what data it needs to display, and doesn't have to do it up front. You can only request the users to consent when they need to see more data in your application.
Yeah.
And that's awesome.
Yeah.
Easy, right?
I told Christos that I kind of want to do like a soup to nuts blog post series on this, because I feel like I learn something new every single day, and I'm hitting REST APIs just like my developer colleagues. So it's one of those things.
You're a developer, Shannon. Deep at heart, you're a developer.
I am. Yeah, right. I think at this point, I think I've at least hurt myself enough to make myself be a true full-blown developer, right?
Now we have 10 minutes, and I think we have a knowledge check, right?
We do.
We want for you to take with us.
Yes.
So we're gonna give it a go, and you can give it a go. Let's see who comes on top, or if I get to keep my job. So Shannon will be asking the questions, and I have to answer the hard answers. Right?
Yeah, and I don't know if Christos is going to get them right. So
let's see if I'm gonna get to keep my job and be invited next year to do another session.
All right.
Surprise me, Shannon.
So,
hit me.
What method does Microsoft Azure App-Service use to obtain credentials for users attempting to access an app?
Okay. So the first one.
What do you think?
Well, the first one says credentials that are stored in the browser. We never, ever want to see you putting any secrets or credentials in the browser, correct?
Correct.
So that can be the answer.
Okay.
Pass-through authentication. I don't think we mentioned anything about pass-through authentication. And although that can be a valid type of authentication for certain scenarios like APIs, it is not a valid answer here in my mind. So I think the last one is redirecting to a provider endpoint. So what happens? Your application your users in your application get redirected to somewhere else to authenticate, Azure Active Directory. That's our identity provider endpoint. Then they authenticate there, and then the application gets back a token. Never accesses the user's data, and that's what we want to do. We don't want you to fiddle with usernames and passwords anywhere. Azure Active Directory does the hard job, so all you have to do is just mesh with the tokens. So I think it's C.
And we're getting some folks that are doing the live poll as well. It looks
nice.
It looks like we may have some consensus here.
Do we have winners?
Let's see. I don't know if we have winners. I don't think we can give.
Everyone is a winner because you
participated.
Everybody's a winner.
Everybody's a winner at Microsoft Build, right? Everybody's a winner. We just can't give you gifts.
Yeah,
Sorry. We can give you funny commentary.
Yeah.
Which is free, unfortunately. But it is what it is, right? So I think we've got enough folks voting.
Mm-hmm.
You're right, Chris.
Yeah, hey.
Keep your job. You get to keep your
1
job.
out of 4. 20%. I'm staying in. 25% says I'm staying in. Okay, good. Let's move on to the next one.
All right, let's do the next one. Okay.
Okay.
So, what type of managed service identities can be created?
Ooh, okay. I hope you were paying attention when Shannon was mentioning that, because she also said that she never created the other type. Right?
Correct. And now I have to, because I've presented on it, right?
Try it. You have to do a demo.
I did.
Not today. Right. Okay. So let's see. We have application assigned and VM assigned. They're not application assigned or VM assigned. They're resource assigned. So that is definitely not the right naming. We never mentioned that. Database assigned and unsigned. I think there's some typos in there. So just for that, I will say definitely no. And then we have system assigned and user assigned, which definitely ring a bell, because that's what Shannon was saying. She only uses the system assigned ones, and we want her to use.
You remembered. You were, even though you're sleep deprived and you are jet lagged.
I was paying attention.
So, and it looks like we've got a very similar consensus here. So
awesome. So let's
go
for
me.
Me.
Let's give it a go.
50%. I'm staying at Microsoft.
Yay! Woohoo! We're in good shape. You keep your job.
Hopefully, you'll see me next year as well. Let's go. Next one.
Okay.
Keep them coming, Shannon.
Let's see. An app service application stores page graphics in an Azure storage account.
Okay.
The app needs to authenticate programmatically to the storage account. What should be configured? Ooh, that's a
tricky one. That is a tricky one.
But I mean, it's kind of like the Microsoft exams that you take. Like,
that is very important. Yes. Yes.
I want to just give it to you.
Don't give it to me. I will have to work for my
Work
for
hard
my
here.
right to be here. Okay, so the first one is
I'm watching the polls too. Okay.
create a user AD system user. We never said anything about system users. Did we ever say system user? There's no system user on Azure Active Directory. There are service principals that are your system users, but we don't use that terminology. So system user is out just because it's not the right term. Now, it does say create a managed identity, which will be our preference. Always, always use a managed identity when you can do it. So I think B is the right answer. However, I have to say that it is half right, because creating a managed identity doesn't give you access to anything until you assign
an RBAC role. Valid.
Exactly.
Valid.
So C is the other bit, but obviously we can't select two. It's not a multi-answer question, so we will go with B as the first one. Always go with the first one, right, Shannon? That's reset.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I think too, when I always take Microsoft exams, I'd always think that like steps 1 and 2 were done, and I'd like answer like steps 3 or 4, and no, I didn't. I had to think about steps 1 and 2.
Start at the beginning. So it's B.
At the beginning. So yeah, let's see if that's right, Christos. Drum
Do
roll.
I get 3 out of 4?
You get to keep your job. Well, okay, there's one more question.
Wait, there must be a baseline that I pass. Or it's like all or nothing, right? Oh, man, this organization is tough.
I love it.
Let's do the last one.
We're the savage org, you know, and it's interesting because this one wasn't as clear cut in the polls. So we had it was predominantly managed identity, but we did have some folks pick RBAC. And that's not necessarily wrong. It's just remember that Microsoft wants you to start from scratch, right? Any specific problem, start as though you haven't done step 1. So that's probably the best way to describe it. Let's see. How are we doing on time here? We're doing pretty good, actually. So let's see if we can answer this one. I think we've got the time. How does using managed identities for Azure resources change the way an app authenticates to Azure Key Vault?
Ooh, that's a doozy. Okay.
Maybe start with what it's not again, because I feel like that might be helpful.
Yes. So the first one, so I would say B, for example, is definitely not the one that we want to say that it is. So the app uses a certificate to authenticate against a secret. No, managed identities have keys behind the scenes, so nobody sees them. So there's no secret or certificate to worry about. We don't even see them. So it's not that. Definitely not B. Then C says managed identities are automatically recognized by Azure Key Vault and authenticated automatically. Again, no, they're not recognized. Although if there is a managed identity that has been configured for Key Vault, then Key Vault will recognize it. However, there is a step before that. So I would say C is not the answer. Okay. Now, that leaves us with A, but that was a controversial topic because we did have a conversation about this before. The app gets a token from a token service instead of Azure Active Directory. Now, is this true? Partially, because this would happen only, and we talked about this scenario before, so I hope everyone was paying attention. We're talking about, does it run on bats and does it run in VMs? And why would you do it inside a VM? So I think it assumes here that you are inside a VM, and then you use that to go and grab the token. So for that, I would say it's A. But the explanation is a little bit iffy here. Like, I don't think this question is very well worded, and we'll work with the team to make it better because it assumes that you because that you have been paying attention.
A is right.
A is right. Yes.
You could easily think it's C based upon what you know now about managed identities, and the bit here is the managed identity hits that what's that
endpoint?
Yeah,
the metadata endpoint.
The metadata endpoint. So
we have 2 minutes to wrap it up.
All right,
Lauren is going to kick us out. So let's go.
Summary slide. Okay, so you learned how to register an application in Azure using an app registration. Pretty straightforward. There's extra things you can think about as you configure it. You can now select and configure with Azure AD which Azure AD users can access each application.
Yeah.
You can also think about how to configure and deploy web app certificates. And we didn't go terribly deep on this one, but there's a bunch of documentation out there.
Or you can reach us on the 45 show and learn.
You can. Right? Yeah. So for more information about the topics discussed in the module, see this short aka.ms link.
Short is, I would say. Use the QR code. I mean, I couldn't type that. I'm
QR
tired
code is
now.
probably going to be your better bet. So
use your
I'll hang
QR
on
code.
here for a couple more seconds.
Yeah.
And then we've got the interactive learning in general. So just, if you followed along, you watched us, you didn't follow the module, this is your opportunity to go to that module and maybe bookmark it for the future, especially if you are studying for the AZ500.
Yes. Not the SC400.
Not the
But
SC400.
if you're studying for the SC400, go and learn there as well, because Learn is full of free content.
Right. And they're all with the role-based certifications. It doesn't matter if you're in Azure, Office 365, what have you, Learn is the spot.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. We had a blast doing this.
Yes, and it was a lot of fun. And Christos is halfway across the world, so thanks for joining. I know it's late your time. It's still early my time, so
lucky you.
I know.
All day ahead of you. And for everybody else, stay tuned. There are awesome sessions after us. Lauren is doing a fantastic job keeping everything running. So thank you, Lauren, for being a trooper. And we will see you next year if we get invited back. Hopefully,
so fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.